Hello, welcome to another episode of GouldFish on Gaming. After the last episode, I figured it might be fun to look at what all those setup programs were actually doing and taking it bit by bit. Now, I think there's four major areas we need to cover: memory, input, graphics, and sound. And so I've taken each of those in turn and tried to explain what the setup programs are doing and why they were doing it. And so let's take a look at it right now and jump right in. Some of the installers asked us, do we want to use EMS or XMS memory? So let's take a look at what these two meant and how the DOS machine handled memory. To start off with, we had 640 kilobytes of what was called conventional RAM. The reason for this quite odd number was that the 8088 processor could only address 1 megabyte, and so 385 kilobytes of this was taken up by system ROMs, add-on card ROMs, hardware addressing, and video device addressing that were dedicated to talking to the ROM, to the graphics card, to the sound cards, to various other devices. And what we got at the end of that was up to 640 kilobytes. Now, because of this limitation and the fact that games were growing, software in particular was growing massively, particularly with the likes of Lotus 123, people started needing more and more memory, but they were limited by the CPU. And so until new CPUs came around, they started looking in ways of being able to extend that memory, and thus they needed to come up with a way of being able to access more memory. Now, they dubbed the system they came up with EMS, the Expanded Memory System. This was a bank switching system. So you could have up to 32 megabytes of RAM, but you could only access 64 kilobytes of it. And even that, only in 16 kilobyte chunks. Newer CPUs came out, which could access larger memory buses, and thus access larger memory amount. But to keep backwards compatibility, this was put in what was called protected mode. And DOS applications needed to use extenders to get access to this memory, and thus it came known as the Extended Memory System, or XMS. Now, one of the more popular of these extenders was known as DOS 4G. These allowed DOS applications to be able to access a whopping 64 megabytes of RAM. And again, with an eye towards backwards compatibility, they allowed you to be able to create extended memory using expanded memory. Next up in our tour is graphics, because it was very common to be asked what display device you had when you were starting the installer, because most of these would only install the necessary graphic for the type of card you were running. The most common graphics devices were the MDA, the monochrome display, CGA, the color graphics, EGA, enhanced graphics, and later VGA, the video graphics. The core difference between most of these devices was resolution, the total colors they supported, and the amount of colours they supported on screen, normally all of these increasing as you go up. Now, a game that supported quite a lot of different hardware devices was Prince of Persia, so I figured it would be a great way to show how the different cards handled graphics. VGA was around for quite some time, and many companies decided they wanted to do higher resolutions and more colours, and came up with their own incompatible SVGA systems. And this led to games having to support multiple different graphics cards, and so you end up having to select your graphics card in the setup program or select the card that was closest to yours. Eventually this got sorted through the VESA Standards Committee, who came up with a common set of BIOS extensions and systems that people were meant to buy into. This didn't always work, and you ended up with programs like Cytex Display Doctor to try and give individual cards better drivers to support all the extensions and thus make it easier for games to run. And so you would see in some games such as Duke Nukem, you would have the option of selecting VGA modes or VESA 2 modes, which indicated that you may need to load up an additional driver. Before we tackle the big bad of PC gaming, I figured now would be a good time to look at inputs. Many setup programs gave you a choice of setting up mouse, keyboard, or even joystick. Some even had the full key rebinding screen inside the setup program. So every time you wanted to make a change to your keyboard inputs, you had to quit out the game, load up the setup, go back through all the information, hope you got it right this time, and quit out and start again. The reason these options were in the setup program was that many games didn't know what input method you were going to use. You may have a mouse, you may not, you may have a joystick, you may not. And on top of that, even if you did have a mouse, it wasn't guaranteed that you were actually going to have enough free conventional memory to be able to load in the mouse driver. I remember back in the day, every time I got a new mouse, or my friends got a new mouse, I would ask to borrow the driver disc and try out the driver on that disc, see if it worked with my mouse, and to see if it used less memory than what I was currently using. Making a good setup disc that could run the maximum amount of games was very important, or you ended up with having multiple discs or having quite a complex menu on your boot disk when you started. And that's not covering devices like CD-ROM drives, which also required their own driver to be loaded. Even some sound cards required a driver to be loaded. So making sure that you had the most amount of conventional RAM for the game was very important. And we arrive at our final destination in this tour, Soundcards. There are so many options for soundcards on PC, ranging from PC speaker to AdLib, via a large number of sound blasters and continuing onto the Roland MIDI devices and Gravis ultrasounds. It would take a whole video just to talk about each of them. So what I figured would be best would be to explain what the setup program is actually doing and why it's doing it. In this example, we will assume that we have both a MIDI device and a digital device. First, we have to set up the MIDI device, and this was simply a memory address. And at first, it was hard-coded into the original AdLib card. So let's say we have a simplified computer. We have a program, we have a CPU, we have memory addresses, and we've got the hardware that's producing the sound. MIDI works by sending the data to be played to the name memory address, and to do this we would have to ask the CPU to transfer the data. So every time we wanted to send more data to the sound card, it had to go via the CPU. And as you can imagine, this took up some CPU time, and it limited how much data we could send. Digital audio was handled a little differently, because they expected to send far more data. So as you can see on the screen, we have far more options. We have a memory address, we've got 2 DMA channels, we've got an interrupt number. These in early cards would have been hard coded. Later cards, they would have been set up by the BIOS or through a setup program. And each card had to have its own IRQ number, so it could access the CPU and talk to the DMA channels. Now, if you had 2 devices with the same interrupt, then you got into the dreaded IRQ conflict, which was a massive pain at the time and very difficult to resolve. So here we have our simplified computer again. If we wanted to send a large amount of digital data to the sound card, we would first interrupt the CPU with our IRQ number. This would tell the DMA channel where it's going to go. With that, we can then start sending data straight from the program to the DMA channel, which would go straight to the hardware, completely bypassing the CPU and being significantly faster. This all looks quite complicated, and it could be, but thankfully many of the setup programs had an auto-detect mode, and they would try and work out what all the settings were automatically. And this was done either through poking known IRQ and memory addresses and hoping to get known responses, or by looking up environment variables with hopefully all the information there already. Because if it got it wrong, you could quite easily hang your computer. Welcome back. And so hopefully you found that interesting, and you can now understand what these setup programs are doing. Now, I've simplified some areas quite a bit and sort of skirted round some of the other issues that came up with these systems. But I think overall, it's a reasonable sort of guide and primer to what these programs are doing. Now, as time went on, these changed quite a bit. There were some games that literally you just installed and you ran it. There was no setup at all. It just worked everything out automatically. And you had other games that would want you to test the speed of your CD-ROM drive because they planned to run everything from the CD. And so you'd actually get these screens and sort of bars flashing all over the place as they were trying to work out how fast it was, and would give you a sort of thumbs up at the end. And you also got the same with some of the CPUs as well to make sure that you were fast enough to run the games. Others was like, nope, we don't care, you bought it, let's just try and run it. So I feel there's quite a range of areas that these machines used to try and cover. And I feel that I've probably made a few mistakes here and there in this video, and if there's any that's glaring, please tell me in the comments. I will try and correct it. But until next time, I've been the GouldFish, this has been GouldFish on Gaming, and until next time, keep on gaming.